Park Hill Flats, Sheffield, is a seminal city symphonic character, iconic post-war slum clearance and City Radieuse Parkland-set housing project conceived from the beginning as picture architecture, intended to change housing conditions in Sheffield, but also to represent this grimy, industrial war-damaged city. As much a protagonist in these images as any of its residents, Park Hill has continued to reflect the conventional narrative of post-war, high-rise public housing in the UK, that of socialist utopia become crime scene, now destined for a regenerated public-private future. At the same time, this is an iconic place in the city. Representations of Park Hill have reflected contemporary views of the changing fortunes of Sheffield itself. It's come to stand not just as a convenient shorthand for these, but images of it in its heyday, in its decline, in an imagined future are frequently used by key actors, politicians, architects, planners, developers, investors to roll the pitch for development practices applied to the city at large. An imagined version of Park Hill towers over Sheffield as much the Crusader Castle as the extant building, with a continuing hold over the public imagination of Park Hill and Sheffield. This is a well-studied site, promoted from the beginning as a case study, where its first tenant was a social worker, embedded to both guide new tenants in their unfamiliar surroundings and understand the impact of this new way of living, with its lifts, Garchi refuse disposal and separation of traffic. My research uses visual art practice to explore official representations of Park Hill, something that's been less well studied, as preserved in a series of archives, especially around the process of planning the building, from the 1950s through subsequent changes and especially its post-2006 public-private rebirth. Through the presentation of some of the works I've made, including installations, a newspaper and a radio play, I'll show you some key aspects of the site's history and offer some new readings of it. This is a journey through found images, finding, dismantling, cutting and pasting images as a means to understand this architecture of the imagination. At the same time, this cut and shut image history is a way of trying to reach and touch the past. There's a careful consideration of the IP and ethical issues around this. The ownership of the imagined and represented architecture is just as important and entwined with that of the built. The first work I'm going to show you is Reconstruction, a projection installation, a carousel of 120 35mm slide transparencies projected near actual size and exhibited in a former garage block at Park Hill. This is a recovery of a now disappeared place. From 2006 onwards, the landscape parkland around the flats has been swept away and replaced with an entirely different and unashamedly contemporary approach. Although listed as a heritage asset, preservation has been largely through recording, and elements that remain are shorn of their original intelligibility and functions. In Reconstruction, I was exploring the idea of making a reconstruction of the landscape, a reworking of archival representations, a fleeting, barely physical rebuilding in light. A flimsy pavilion built from history and time sitting alongside the well-known monument, imagined, existing separately from, but dependent on and acting on the built monolith. The process was deceptively simple, beginning with the identification of images of the parkland from a set of archival images, digitised from the city archives and other contemporary sources from the late 1950s and early 1960s, most taken for publicity and news reporting. As official views, whether from the council's own photographer or carefully guided contemporary press reports, these images act as demonstrations of intent. This is the landscape staged in its ideal form. Each of these images is extremely closely cropped from the originals, focusing on details of the lost landscape. Park is a protagonist in these images, an active character as much as subject. In focusing on one specific element, the landscape, we can explore the representation of this character. Here, openings and buildings frame vistas of soot-blackened buildings, a delight in the picturesque, but also the crosshairs of future transformation. Wide open spaces meet their match in generously sized prams, a site well equipped for the baby boom, but intended to last for and act on generations to come. The structure frames and directs the play of its younger residents. Everywhere there's dazzling brightness, emphasising the sculptural qualities of the landscape as glamorous as a representation of any residents who, in the 1960s Sunday best, are certainly from our 2022 perspective, pretty glamorous. At the same time, from 2022, there's a dramatic irony in some of these images. Early water staining on concrete, tyre marks on the grass, unswept paths, and these empty spaces which will become so remorselessly empty in the future. As an installation with the sound, heat and smell of the 35mm slide projector in the stripped-back concrete of Park Hill, we can't help but make comparisons across time. This nearly forgotten method of image display reflects the uncertain temporality of these images themselves. The installation could have been staged in 1965, and as we cross the projector beam, having walked up through Park Hill's re-landscaped gardens, our shadows blend with those of long-gone residents, and we're invited back in time to consider the action of the past on the present, but also the action of the present on the past. I've been thinking very deliberately about this installation as an architecture, in two ways: as something that exists spatially, but also as a restructuring of an archive, drawing on Jill Stoner's ideas of a Deleuzian minor architecture. This installation at Park Hill is a speculation on whether this reconstruction could exist in these terms, and an attempt to unpick some of the lines of force that structure this architecture. This next work, A New Landscape, plays further with the reprojection of found images and the layering of history. It's a two-screen video installation where images drawn from the post-2006 regeneration planning documents are placed side by side, those representing the past alongside those of the future, a slow scrolling through of images decay, the threatening abandoned landscape set against images of an imagined better future, of rolling hills of the Peak District or of Barcelona Square. The images are drawn from different kinds of documents, design and access statements with their mood board imagery, and technical reports, artless documents of specific features, trees, ecological parcels, heritage assets. Shorn of their original context, we see, to an extent, what's really there. Here there's no cropping, but an invitation to see. In the arboricultural reports, for example, images are a sequence of each tree at Park Hill, individually documented, but as far as the report is concerned, the image does little more than evidence the existence of a tree. And yet, these images leak out other meanings. A painted goalpost remains on a concrete wall, one of the surveyors at work. These are images we don't normally see, the process of making a place, of working on it, images that aren't our public imaginary, but yet bring it into being. As each image is slowly cycled through, conjunctions, juxtapositions start to occur. These temporary collages producing, I hope, momentary new readings of the site as well as new readings of the images. The decaying concrete of Park Hill is set amongst a wilderness of barely managed grassland, seen within a history of landscape. Stock images of paving losing to an extent their existence as the representation of the workaday object, and viewers are invited to consider their formal, abstract quality. There's never any present. These images are already archived and past, trees reported on and removed, or are a never to be realised future. These images hint at and slide around the edges of articulating what will be, image fragments from the past projected into the future. This disjuncture, what I've called the was and the will be, is deliberate. Is a moment of crisis, of a failure, where a promised future fails to live up to the past in these hauntological yet workaday representations. These found images are fragments, literally witness to a previous dismantling, whether of this landmark building or of 100 other architectural schemes collected and represented as design and access statements. The kaleidoscope-like experience of this, these bright digital images silently sliding into view, is important. There's a rhythmic pace, a slow monumentality despite the obvious flaws of these found images, where artless composition, ill-focused subjects, pixelation and glitches can be tracked, echoing their own image life through site, camera, hard copy and digital and digitized archives. Throughout, time is twisted, slowed. The endless development process runs alongside nature, reclaiming an increasingly untamed wilderness. I've further explored the imagined landscape through experiments with the will-be images. I took these through various attempts at making a publication, intending to see how, shorn of their context, they might begin to iterate new meanings. This was a deliberately playful process. If you put these images together, what can you make? The end result is a 16-page tabloid newspaper, Prospect, the medium imposing an internal logic, as with the previous works. Here, the combination of unstapled but folded spreads invites new arrangements and new logics. This iterative process raised questions and suggested different visual structures and architectures of these images, structures where all the images align on a single point perspective, or begin to inscribe circles or a forest canopy. There's again a digital materiality to this, working with the images of varying sizes and qualities, the warp and the weft of the pixels to some extent determining where they sit. As an artist and curator, I found this fascinating. My only encounter with the originals of these images is via PDFs scraped from the planning portal, yet this process became a sculptural and curatorial one. How might we handle these images? How might they be picked up and turned in space? And I'm interested in the heft and the weight of these images. In a planning system where giving weight is part of the assessment process to the National Planning Framework or the local plan, the weight of these images seems important, and of course a consideration of what weight is given to them. When we look at these glossy images of the future, does their sheen convey an additional power that the more documentary images represented by, say, the arboricultural reports don't have? Or does their grungy veracity convey an objectivity or scientificity against the shallowness of the marketeer? That these are representation as index is important. They index both Park Hill, the was and the will be, but also an ideal of place, the perfect square, the well-tended garden. But crucially, they link this to our, as viewers, own ideal landscape. The final work I'm going to take you through builds on this mining of the source material as object, as fragments to rework and explore. Radio plays a script, developed as verbatim theatre from the planning archives. It's a dramatisation of conversations between key actors in the development and redevelopment of Park Hill from the 1950s to the present, focused primarily on its initial construction and experiences of its early residents, and its more recent regeneration as refracted through preserved documents, sometimes direct quotes, but also the piecing together of conversations conducted through terse typewritten memos or the deciphering of scrawled feedback sheets from public workshops. It charts the place's changing fortunes, using the verbal and written representations of those involved to do so. Here, I'm using voices from the past to unpick those of the more recent past, and the present being still elusive. Hopes of the future from the 1960s versus those from the 2010s. Residents' voices captured through forgotten letters to council, responses to questionnaires, comments on planning applications. The dialogue in radio play pivots around description of place, of activity, heavily laden with imagery. A 1950 purposing of the basement of a demolished church feels like a battlefield decision, the setting up of a temporary command centre during the Battle of Normandy. Elsewhere, 21st century chatty developer speak evokes pulp sci-fi and an unconscious echo of the difficulties of persuading people to live in this novel, alien space. Just the same difficulties faced by Sheffield Housing Department in the 1950s. The use of landscape imagery is particularly prominent. In this city of hills, images of mountains bridge the gap between the sublime and the inhabitable, although it's unclear that the use of the nearby Peak District is any less clumsy in attempting to make the scale of the building feel human than comparisons to a train coming through a tunnel in a Swiss mountain. Whilst images recur often, their impact varies. In both the 50s and 2000s, there's a constant recycling of images of European parks and squares. Al fresco living perhaps washes over early residents more concerned with the promised replacement of their lost bingo nights. Yet in more recent times, these are very much more than just an aspirational landscape template, the pleasure of the city break. They are internalised in residents' comments as a way of coping with conflicting use of the site, shops and takeaways, major events that disturb their peace. These images are used collage-like to connect specific parts of our own mental landscapes to the development. Descriptions of children's play are used sometimes to convey freedom and the sense of building a community. Other times are used to exclude, to limit public access for children's supposed safety. Of particular interest is the way this format helps to structure and understand the concerns of residents of the redeveloped Park Hill, giving life to comments they've made in the planning system. These, over a period of around a decade, from the first families moving in to the later phases gaining approval, reflect their lived experiences of Park Hill, but also as responses to the imagined places sketched out in the planning applications they're commenting on, the effect that these have. This is more complex than objections that might typically be levelled at new developments. These residents aren't just concerned about the impact the new development will have on them, they're concerned about its deviation from the imagined place they bought into, which, given the slow pace of development, none of these residents have ever inhabited a finished building. Here, even the prosaic rubs up against the imagined monument. The gravel from the Tuileries-inspired paths gets caught in the doors. Park Hill's use as an iconic venue for the finish of a cycle race causes noise and disruption. Often this is discussed in imagistic terms. Concerns, for example, that all the social housing being in one block will see that block being represented as the social housing block. A concern for property values masked, or masking the altruistic utopian ideal of the mixed community that these owner-occupiers have bought into. Who can blame them? They're consumers of a historico-utopian fantasy, as much pioneers of a new way of living, owner-occupiers of a brutalist monument as their mid-20th century forebears. This self-identification of pioneers, apparent now as it was in the 50s, is, I suggest, vital for a development that has such a long timescale, that's still a building site, and that's still in a challenging area of the city, rubbing up against some of the city's poorest residents. My research isn't looking at whether or not the development is a success or failure. I'd suggest it's more successful than credited, less difficult and innovatory than assumed, but to trace and show the scope of imagery used in its production. In the radio play, I've deliberately created two parallel scenes, excavating dialogue from a late 1960s news report and planning comments from the 21st century, each containing the thoughts of two real households. Concerns are different. It's striking how much more concerned the more recent residents are with creating a community than those early pioneers. What strongly comes through both, though, is a sense of powerlessness, whether that's the council putting up the rents but not fixing problems, or later the developer refusing to engage with residents. I find this gap fascinating. I wonder to what extent it conforms to the gap between representation and reality, and the failure of these representations.